Dawn pressed gray light against Emily's window as her phone buzzed with a voicemail from her mother. Emily said, "Mom, I missed your call," and then the message played with a tremor she had never heard. Margaret said, "Sweetheart, I am fine," but the words broke as metal clanged far away. The second buzz knocked the air from the room as a courier slid an envelope under the door. Emily said, "Not now." Yet she knelt because dread already knew the answer. The notice bore Richard's smooth signature, and the family logo like a seal on a sentence. The paper said the last grace period had expired and her mother's shop would be seized. Emily said, "He does not even know us," and her chest burned as if the letters were hot. Rain ticked the sill while the kettle hissed without boiling, like time stuck in place. She dialed her mother and reached only the humming of a hospital ward. Emily said, "I will fix this," and her voice steadied around a vow she had not made before. She looked at the city beyond the glass and saw mirrors, not faces. The envelope crumpled in her fist, and a new life began without asking. Emily stepped into the hospital corridor, where floors shone like a mirror, and time refused to move. Emily said, "I am here," and the words were more for herself than anyone else. The nurse nodded at the chart and pointed to a door with quiet eyes. Margaret lay under thin blankets, with wires tracing stories on a monitor. Margaret said, "It is not as bad as it sounds," and even the beeping disagreed. Emily recalled how her mother taught her to stand tall, even with empty pockets. She remembered the shop smelling of soap and pine cleaner after long nights. Emily said, "They sent a notice and placed the folded paper on the chair like a witness." Margaret said, "You will not break," and her gaze was clear though tired. The machine ticked like a metronome for courage and grief. Emily said, "I will learn everything I need, and I will not quit." A plan formed around hours, skills, and a new language to unlock doors. She held her mother's hand and counted breaths until the tremor stilled. Sophia met Emily outside the hospital with an umbrella that smelled like rain and detergent. Sophia said, "You look like you fought a wave," and pulled her into a firm hug. Emily said, "Richard signed the notice, and the name stuck like grit between teeth." Sophia said, "Then we go smarter, not harder," and her certainty lit a small flame. They walked past posters about language classes pinned to a damp board. Emily said, "I will master words the way he masters contracts." Sophia said, "English opens halls he thinks are closed to you." The city hissed with buses and wet tires, and their footsteps found a rhythm. Emily said, "I will not be lazy with my hours," and she typed a schedule in her notes. Sophia said, "I will watch the baby Thursdays so you can study." Their friendship felt like scaffolding built overnight. Emily lifted her chin, as if the skyline were a sentence she could finish. The language class smelled of dry markers and warm dust from old radiators. Daniel sat near the window, sketching in a battered notebook. Daniel said, "The city looks softer in rain," and he closed the book when Emily entered. Emily said, "I am here to change the shape of my life," and took a front seat. The teacher wrote verbs like keys on the board and asked them to unlock doors. Daniel said, "Words are brushes," and the metaphor eased her fear. Emily repeated sentences until her tongue learned to trust. She pictured future interviews where her voice did not tremble. Daniel said, "You learn fast when it matters," and his eyes held quiet respect. Emily said, "I cannot afford slow," and the class laughed with her and not at her. The clock hands slid, and the rain thinned to a mist of possibility. She left with pages warm from effort and a new friend. Back home, Emily spread the notice, the class notes, and a blank weekly plan across the table. Emily said no more drifting, and drew blocks of time like bricks for a bridge. She added study sprints, work shifts, and calls to the bank. She marked practice for speaking aloud, and daily drills for verbs. Sophia texted a heart and a promise to quiz her on Fridays. Emily said, "I will face Richard's world in his language," and breathed easier. She set alarms for dawn recitations and night reviews. Margaret replied with a tiny sun emoji and the word brave. Emily said, tomorrow I start with present tense, then I build. She practiced a sentence until it felt like a tool. Outside, sirens faded, and the rain became a hush. She taped the plan to the wall, and held the pen like a key. She slept with purpose pressed under her pillow. Dawn returned like a teacher with a bell, and Emily sat up before it rang. Emily said, today I add 10 new verbs, and she boiled eggs while reciting tenses. The wall plan waited, full of squares colored by purpose. She spoke into a mirror to train her mouth to move with certainty. Emily said, I will kill laziness by naming hours, and her pen ticked boxes with small victories. She listened to a podcast and shadowed each line until breath matched rhythm. The kettle clicked, and she switched to pronunciation drills. Emily said, focus is love for my future, and she smiled at the thought. Margaret texted a thumbs up and a reminder to eat. Emily answered with a photo of her notes and a bright mug. She recorded herself and played it back, hearing progress where fear once lived. Emily said, I respect myself when I work, and the room felt larger. By 8, she wore confidence like a simple, clean shirt. At the cafe, the manager pointed to a line that curved like a question mark. Emily said, good morning, how may I help you? And the sentence felt steady in her chest. A tourist asked for oat milk and a map, and she guided both with patient hands. The espresso hissed like applause, and her confidence rose with the crema. Daniel arrived with a sketchbook and a gentle nod. Daniel said, your voice sounds taller today, and the compliment landed like a stone on a foundation. Emily said, practice builds muscle, even in the mouth, and she laughed softly. A complaint form slid across the counter from a frowning banker. Emily said, I will fix it quickly, and her language did not wobble. The man left with a grudging thanks and less thunder in his eyes. Emily wrote a new phrase on a sticky note and pocketed it like currency. The shift ended with tired feet and a bright spine. Emily reached the bank to negotiate a pause on the seizure. Marble floors echoed like a warning, and the ceiling held a cold sky of lights. A receptionist scanned her documents with a patient smile. Emily said, I request a hardship review, and her words stayed clear. A door opened and Richard stepped out in a suit that fit like armor. Richard said, Miss Hart, I admire initiative, and his smile was polished glass. Emily said, I will not beg, I will reason, and his eyes measured the edges of her resolve. He praised policy as if it were mercy, and called deadlines natural law. Emily said, law should not crush the small just to feed the large. Richard's charm cooled by a degree, like shade moving over a step. He offered a brochure and a handshake that pressed too long. Emily said, I will return with stronger terms, and she gathered her papers. The lobby felt less enormous as she walked out upright. Outside the bank, an older man offered his seat on a low stone ledge. Liam said, you held your ground without heat, and his voice carried a calm tide. Emily said, he plays with rules like strings on a violin, and frustration left her shoulders. Liam said, strings can sing for you if you learn them well. He revealed he once wore the same suit and walked those same halls. Emily said, why did you leave power? And curiosity cracked the shell of fatigue. Liam said, because a win without peace is a loss in disguise. He spoke of breath, posture, and the rhythm of listening. Emily practiced a calmer inhale and felt her pulse slow. Liam said, you will need stillness as much as grammar, and he smiled like weather clearing. Emily said, teach me what time cannot steal, and he nodded. The city noise seemed to fall into a kinder pattern around them. Evening found Emily at her desk, building a case like a careful bridge. Emily said facts first, then feeling, and she outlined income, hospital costs, and timelines. She wrote a letter to the bank using the language of the policy itself. Liam's notes reminded her to breathe between points. Emily said, clarity is kindness, even in conflict, and the tone sharpened without cruelty. She added a proposal for a temporary plan tied to measurable progress. Sophia called to check on dinner and on courage. Sophia said, You are not alone in the hard hour, and the words steadied her lamp. Emily said, I will show up tomorrow with proof and patience. She rehearsed her opening lines until they sounded like a door unlocking. She sealed the envelope and placed it beside the schedule. Resolve hummed like a quiet engine beneath the night. Morning sun found Emily at the bank, with her proposal printed clean and brave. Emily said, I request a temporary restructure, and she placed the folder like a bridge. The officer scanned the figures and called a supervisor. Richard appeared with a smile shaped like a rulebook. Richard said, Your effort is admirable, and his tone stacked compliments like bricks. Emily said, Effort is not charity, it is equity, and her voice held. He nodded at policy clauses as if they were hymns. Richard said, We can consider a trial period if collateral improves. Emily said, Collateral is a living person's labor and plan. He countered with timelines that shortened like shrinking corridors. Emily glanced at the window and saw her reflection standing taller than fear. Emily said, Approve 90 days, tied to verified income and study hours. Richard paused like a card player reading tells. He smiled again and promised a response by week's end. She walked out with steady steps, aware he had not said yes. At the community center, Sophia set up chairs for an evening workshop on job language. Sophia said, Teach what you learn, and the lesson stays, and she handed Emily a whiteboard marker. Emily said, I will drill clear verbs and polite anchors, and nerves pricked like rain. Daniel arrived with handouts he designed with quiet care. Daniel said, Words earn light when shared, and the line made her grin. Emily presented greetings, requests, and firm refusals. A teenager asked how to say no without burning bridges. Emily said, I appreciate the offer, but I must decline for now. Applause felt like soft weather rolling in. Sophia said, Your voice carries balance, and pride flickered warm. Emily collected questions for next week and felt a new spine grow. She checked her phone and saw no reply from the bank. Emily said, Patience is also work, and the room settled into calm cleanup. Night brought an unexpected message from a familiar number that once meant home. Isaac said, I am in town for work, and the screen tightened her breath. Emily said, I hope you are well, and old echoes stirred then quieted. They agreed to meet in a public cafe under bright lights. Isaac arrived with a ring he kept rubbing like a coin. Isaac said, I was not good to you, and his eyes lowered. Emily said, We were unready, and I needed truth I could not speak. He asked about her mother, and the shop, and the notice. Emily said, I am fighting with language and time, and she felt strong naming it. Isaac said, I wanted to save us back then, but I feared myself. Emily said, I forgive the past, but I do not live there now. He nodded, both chastened and free. She left feeling lighter, as if untying a rope that had dragged behind for years. 2 days later, the bank response arrived with a clause Richard had not mentioned. The trial period required an early balloon payment that mocked her math. Emily said, He wants a stumble he can call fate, and she breathed to slow her pulse. She took the letter to Liam by the river where gulls argued with wind. Liam said, Name the pressure, then choose your posture, and he waited. Emily said, I feel trapped, so I will widen the path, and she sketched options. They planned a community pledge for temporary support, and a second revenue stream. Liam said, When power closes a door, build a window that opens inward. Emily recorded a video message in clear English, asking for short-term clients. She offered tutoring and translation practice at fair rates. Liam said, You invite dignity, not pity, and the river sounded kinder. Emily said, Richard will not write my story's ending, and hope stood up inside her. That evening, Emily and Daniel filmed the outreach video in the courtyard. Daniel said simple light and honest eyes, and he adjusted a reflector. Emily said, I help with basic English for work and forms, and her delivery held. She added schedule slots and a low starter fee that scaled with progress. Sophia cheered from off camera and made a heart with her hands. Daniel said, "One more take for rhythm," and they captured it clean. They posted to neighborhood groups and pinned flyers by laundry rooms. Notifications began with a quiet ping that sounded like morning. Emily said, "We build this hour by hour," and she exhaled a smile. She checked on Margaret, who laughed at a corny sitcom and called her brave. Emily said, "Tomorrow, I show the bank a living plan," and the courtyard lights blinked like stars on wires. The night felt busy with small doors opening. Morning arrived with messages from neighbors who wanted lessons before work. Emily said, "I can meet at 7, and her calendar blossomed like a small orchard. A tailor needed phrases for invoices, and a porter needed polite refusals. Emily said, "Practice with real breath," and they echoed her steady cadence. She logged hours for the bank and felt the plan grow muscle. Daniel photographed her whiteboard to design clearer sheets. Daniel said, "Your method turns fear into steps," and the words warmed the room. At noon, a bank email requested documentation beyond their agreement. Emily said, "He moved the goalposts," and the old chill brushed her neck. Richard's name hovered in the thread like a watermark. She answered with precise attachments and timestamps. Emily said, "I will not blink first," and resumed drills with patience. By evening, she had helped 3 clients write emails that sounded like doors opening. The workshop swelled with chairs borrowed from a church hall next door. Sophia said, "We doubled attendance," and her clipboard smiled with neat check marks. Emily said, "We keep it simple and brave," and she paced verbs like drum beats. A janitor asked for phrases to defend his break time with respect. Emily said, "I value my work and need 10 minutes to return strong." Applause folded around them like a blanket. Daniel added icons to a handout so beginners found meaning faster. "What a world." Emily said, "Words should lift, not bruise," and faces softened with relief. An observer from a local paper took notes near the door. Sophia said, "Visibility brings allies," and she nudged a flyer higher. Emily checked her phone and found silence from the bank. She kept teaching with a smile that felt chosen, not borrowed. The evening closed with a chorus of thank yous that sounded like sunrise. After class, Liam asked Emily to walk by the river where gulls stitched silver threads. Liam said, "I should tell you why I left that tower," and his voice smoothed the wind. He had been Richard's father's strategist before his own conscience mutinied. Liam said, "Profit grew faster than mercy," and he folded his hands with care. He had watched talented people shrink under invisible ceilings. Emily said, "You knew this game from inside," and understanding clicked. He shared the pattern of delays used to tire challengers into surrender. Liam said, "They admire stamina only when it belongs to them," and his eyes softened. He taught her to mirror a clause back with a question that resets the ground. Emily said, "I will answer with clarity and time limits of my own." The river lifted the words and returned them brighter. She felt the twist of the story open like a window no one expected. The next morning, the cafe manager frowned over an email with corporate letterhead. The lease renewal now required weekend shifts that collided with Emily's classes. Emily said, "That is not coincidence," and the pattern traced Richard's silhouette. The manager shrugged with sympathy, but pointed to policy like a locked drawer. Emily said, "I will adjust without surrender," and she reshuffled blocks on her plan. Sophia offered to cover study childcare for another parent on Sundays. Sophia said, "We pull each other across the river," and her grin sharpened courage. Daniel rearranged filming slots, so Emily kept her outreach steady. Daniel said, "We bend, we do not break," and his reflector flashed like a small moon. Emily wrote to the bank setting her own response deadline. She asked for a meeting with a compliance officer rather than Richard. Emily said, "If he blocks the door, I will choose the staircase," and her steps felt deliberate. By night, messages chimed from new clients who saw the article the Observer posted. Emily said, "We turn attention into action," and she confirmed slots with clear terms. Margaret sent a photo of the shop's sign polished by a neighbor for luck. Margaret said, Hope is a chore we do daily, and pride brightened the text. Emily drafted her meeting brief using Liam's mirror questions. She listed acceptable outcomes and boundaries like rails on a bridge. Daniel said, your outline reads like music in 4 bars, and he printed copies. Sophia prepared testimonials from students who gained hours at work. Emily said, we will stack truth higher than threat, and the room steadied. She placed the folder beside the envelope that had started all this. Outside, the city hummed not as warning but as drumline. Tomorrow would test the new shape of her courage. The compliance meeting opened in a glass room that felt like someone had bottled noon. Emily said, thank you for your time, and she set her folder down with deliberate care. A woman from compliance scanned her proposal while Richard watched like a hawk, pretending to nap tight. Richard said, we encourage initiative, and the words wore velvet over wire. Emily said, 90 days with verified milestones and a review at 60, and her cadence held. She handed testimonials and new client invoices, each signed and dated. The officer asked about sustainability beyond the trial window, and Emily answered with a growth map. Richard said, market volatility may void optimism, and the smile pinched. Emily said discipline outlasts volatility, and the rooms hung sharpened. The officer requested a short addendum, due by morning, and promised a decision by Friday. Richard said, we value clarity, yet his eyes forecast weather. Emily stepped out, feeling both emptied and forged. By late afternoon, a rumor crawled across the cafe like a slow leak. A blog claimed Emily's lessons were unlicensed and exploitative. Emily said, who posted this? And her stomach dipped as she read the headline. The language mimicked Richard's memos, polished and cold. Sophia said, we respond with receipts, not rage, and she gathered documentation. Daniel said, I will design a statement that breathes, and he sketched a clear layout. Emily said, I am registered as a community tutor, rates published, scholarships noted, and she assembled proof. Comments swelled with strangers deciding her worth. Liam said, hold the center, name the wind, not your fear, and the ground steadied. Emily recorded a calm video listing facts and inviting audits. She said, we accept oversight, we reject slander, and the words rang. The first supportive messages arrived from students whose hours had grown. A storm had started, but she could steer. Evening brought a call from the compliance officer requesting an urgent clarification. The blog had flagged her income verification as inconsistent with timestamps. Emily said, the platform records in UTC, my invoices show local time, and she emailed crosswalk notes. Richard said, errors erode trust, and his CC felt like a finger on a bruise. Emily said, correction is integrity, and she appended server logs and student confirmations. Liam said, they want you tired, so breathe between proofs, and she drank water slowly. Sophia forwarded a list of public endorsements with contact numbers. Daniel updated the statement with a clear timeline graphic. Emily said, we keep the light on our process, and her pulse steadied. The officer thanked her for the precise detail and promised to review overnight. Emily looked at the city and decided to practice verbs instead of doom-scrolling. The night answered with a quieter heart. Morning cracked open with an email marked confidential and a calendar invite. The decision meeting moved earlier, and Richard had added a new participant. Emily said, we walk into weather, not away, and she aligned her notes. The new face was a legal counsel whose smile never touched his eyes. Counsel said, we must ensure no reputational risk. And the phrase smelled of smoke. Emily said, risk falls when terms are fair and transparent, and she presented her addendum. Richard said her venture depends on goodwill that may fade, and he slid a graph across the table. Emily countered with signed commitments and a modest reserve. She proposed a clause tying progress to measurable literacy outcomes. The officer's posture softened as the logic clicked into place. Counsel said, We can pilot under compliance supervision, and the temperature shifted. Richard nodded with a cordial chill, already plotting another avenue. Emily breathed, as if the room had learned a new language. That night the article's comments shifted as students posted before and after stories. Porter wrote he kept his lunch break after learning Emily's phrasing. A tailor shared invoices that now got paid on time. Emily said, "Your voices matter more than my defense," and she thanked each by name. Margaret sent a photo of the shop window with fresh flyers and a small crowd. Margaret said, "Community is a verb," and Emily laughed through tears. Daniel said, "We survived the storm by steering, not shouting," and he closed his laptop. Sophia said, "Rest is also resistance," and she set a timer for sleep. Emily said, "Tomorrow I meet the bank with calm hands," and she placed the approved pilot draft on the table. She whispered the present perfect and future simple like prayers. The city, once an adversary, now sounded like a choir warming up for dawn. Morning tilted bright over the city as Emily rehearsed in the mirror with measured breath. Emily said, "Today I speak plainly and stand still," and her shoulders settled. Daniel checked her slides and aligned margins like rails on a bridge. Daniel said, "Your clarity is the room's compass," and he squeezed her hand. Sophia packed letters from students who had gained hours and raises. Sophia said, "Truth travels lighter than rumor," and her smile steadied the air. Margaret phoned to say a neighbor stocked the shop for free. Margaret said, "Win the day, I will keep the door open," and pride warmed the line. Liam arrived with notes on tone and pace, and a final reminder to pause. Liam said, "Silence is part of language too," and the advice cut noise. Emily reviewed the bank's pilot terms and her milestones to date. She mapped 3 asks and 3 boundaries on a card. Emily said, "I will not be baited," and she placed the card near her heart. The elevator doors closed on doubt and opened on resolve. The hearing room faced the city like a stage with glass curtains. A panel waited with neat pens, and Richard sat to one side like weather in a suit. Richard said, "We applaud enterprise when it respects structure," and his voice rang. Emily said, "Structure protects when it is fair," and she met each gaze. She presented income logs, attendance sheets, and verified progress charts. Council asked about sustainability beyond 90 days. Emily said, "We scale with documented outcomes and capped intake," and the math held. Richard slid a memo suggesting complaints had doubled since her launch. Emily said, "Visibility invites questions," and we answered each with audit access. She read 3 testimonies about safer workplaces after language gains. The panel leaned in as her cadence slowed at key turns. Liam said, "Name your boundary," and she breathed and did. Emily said, "We accept monitoring, not moving targets," and the sentence settled like a mass. The room shifted from trial to dialogue. Richard's smile narrowed as he produced a glossy report on reputational risk. Richard said past personal instability raises flags, and he mentioned Emily's breakup and debts. Isaac rose from the back with a quiet throat, clear and steady eyes. Isaac said, "I failed her once, but truth helps now," and he offered a signed timeline. His statement confirmed she stabilized finances before lessons began. Emily said, "I am not defined by grief. I am refined by effort," and the line held. Richard cited a clause allowing termination for negative press momentum. Liam stepped forward with a historic policy revision he had authored. Liam said, "That clause requires material harm, not rumor heat," and the panel checked. Council nodded as the footnote aligned with citations. Sophia read 2 updates showing corrections issued by the blog. Emily said, "We meet standards that the bank itself teaches," and the mirror turned. Richard's pen stilled as the wind shifted across his sails. Deliberation moved like rain behind glass, and then returned, as weather you could feel. The officer said, "We approve the 90-day restructure with compliance oversight," and pens clicked. Conditions tied to documented outcomes and fixed review dates. Emily said, Thank you for fairness and clarity. And the words were steady. Richard said, we expect strict adherence, and the smile cooled without triumph. Emily replied that adherence was the plan's spine, not its cage. Liam said, shake the hand without giving away your center, and she did. Daniel exhaled a tiny laugh that sounded like a string plucked right. Sophia squeezed Emily's arm and whispered that courage had learned grammar. The officer added a note recommending the program as a pilot model. The room rose, lighter by a shade. Richard gathered his papers with calm hands and unreadable eyes. Emily stepped into the corridor and felt the floor finally match her step. Evening brought a class packed tighter than the chairs could bear. Emily said, we celebrate by working, and the room answered with pens ready. She taught assertive requests and graceful refusals, and a new template for emails. Margaret listened on speaker and clapped at the breaks. Margaret said, the shop breathed today, and relief colored her words. Daniel recorded snippets for a tutorial series with simple captions, and DIY-wide. Sophia coordinated signups for scholarships, funded by small pledges. Liam sat in the back with eyes half closed, measuring the calm. Emily said, kill laziness by naming your hour and honoring it, and heads nodded. She reminded them that English was a tool, not a throne. The final drill ended with laughter that sounded like windows opening. Emily said, tomorrow we build again, and she touched the taped plan. The night outside glowed like a patient road, waiting for footprints. Morning broke clear and sharp, like a bell calling the city to attention. Emily said, today I close the circle, and she tightened the strap on her bag. Margaret texted a blessing and a photo of the shop's clean window. Margaret said, come home with good news, and warmth traveled the wire. Liam walked beside her, and matched her pace to breath and purpose. Liam said, speak to truth, not to vanity, and the world steadied. Daniel carried the presentation case, and a quiet grin of belief. Daniel said, your work is the headline, and he tapped the folder once. Sophia gathered testimonials like bright flags ready to rise. Sophia said, we stand with facts and heart, and her eyes shone. The bank tower glimmered, not as a threat, but as a test. Emily said, I have learned to name storms and to sail, and the doors slid open. The lobby air felt cooler than fear, and kinder than hope. She stepped into the elevator and left doubt on the marble. The final review gathered more eyes than any meeting before. Richard said, we will assess continuation, and his tone tried to own the air. Council arranged papers like tiles that could shift the floor. Emily said, my pilot met every metric and lifted hours for workers. She showed charts where wages rose after language gains. Sophia read a porter's note about keeping his break with calm phrases. Daniel revealed a tutorial series cued for broader reach. Liam said, let outcomes lead policy, and the sentence carried weight. Richard produced a new concern about reputational shadows. Emily said, we documented every audit and corrected every misstep. The officer asked for a final statement to guide the room. Emily said, we do not beg mercy, we prove value and accept fair terms. Silence folded in like breath before a wave. The panel nodded as if the tide had chosen its direction. Richard shifted as if a small stone had found its way into his shoe. Richard said, ambition can hide a hunger that harms, and he watched for a flinch. Emily said, harm hides in delays that starve the small. And she held his gaze. He spoke of legacy and the weight of a family name like a chain of gold. Liam said, legacy should protect the many, not only the few, and the room cooled. Richard's smile thinned and then slipped as memory climbed his face. He remembered a worker fired after a late bus and a policy he could have bent. Richard said, what would prevent abuse tomorrow, and the question wavered. Emily said, clear caps, publish rates, audits, and a community board. She invited Richard to sponsor the oversight without owning it. Daniel nodded, as if a chord resolved where noise had been. Sophia said, power can choose to guard rather than gatekeep. The officer's pen paused, then wrote. Richard watched his reflection and saw a man choosing a mirror. Decision time arrived like a tide that had studied every rock. The officer said, "We extend the restructure and adopt the pilot as a model. Terms fixed, audits scheduled, outcomes tied to renewal." Emily said, "Thank you for choosing clarity," and relief did not weaken her spine. Richard stood and offered a sponsorship for the community board. Richard said guardianship, not control, and the words felt new in his mouth. Liam's eyes softened, proud and careful. Daniel said, "We will publish the caps and process today," and he lifted the case. Sophia hugged Emily with a quick squeeze that said finish the paperwork first. Margaret's text arrived with a line about a new customer and a vase of flowers. Margaret said, "The sign looks brighter," and joy flashed through the screen. Emily signed without shaking and placed the pen down like a small flag. The room exhaled as if the building itself believed in better rules. At dusk the community hall filled beyond the last row of chairs. Emily said, "We kill laziness by naming our hour and honoring it," and voices answered. She taught one last drill that felt like a door swinging wide. Daniel filmed while kids in the back repeated verbs like a game. Sophia collected new pledges for scholarships with quick, kind hands. Liam watched the room breathe as if a storm had passed for good. Isaac stood at the edge and raised a hand in quiet respect. Margaret entered with a fresh sign for the shop, edges still damp from paint. Margaret said, "Hope stays when we work it," and applause rose. Emily said, "Prove yourself by showing up, not by showing off," and the echo held. She closed with a sentence that had changed her life. Emily said, "I am not my fear, I am my practice," and the hall went still. Then the crowd erupted like morning breaking twice.